Yo, yo, yo. As usual, hello. Welcome to the Twitch channel where we're going to be talking about some week one review. My name is James McCool. If you are not familiar with who I am or what I do, I run all the stuff over at paydirt.ghost.io, my site for all the DFS sports, NFL, NBA, MLB, League of Legends, Counter-Strike, all that stuff. And I'm going to be doing some reviews every single week on Monday of the main slate for the NFL, how I did personally, the plays that I thought would do well, the plays that I thought would do badly, kind of going over the models that we had up on the site for subscribers. Going to be breaking down some of the top lineups, the ones that won in not only the Millie Maker, but also some of the higher dollar stuff, as well as some subscriber lineups. I pulled 5 lineups, I think, from subscribers in the Discord so that we could kind of go over what they played, who they liked, who we all liked as a group and as a community, and just kind of trying to talk through some things, with some hindsight so that we can try to get better for next week. Right now, I have pulled up the winner of the $150 entry. I should go back in and grab the Millie Maker winner as well. Where's the Millie Maker? There it is. So it was Chumley54 that won the Millie Maker with a Packers stack with Raheem Mostert, Josh Jacobs, Calvin Ridley as outside pieces, and the Washington football team defense, which, yeah, I mean, all of those plays make sense. And then for the 150, it was considerably lower score, and we're usually going to see that. I mean, the Millie Maker is going to have basically the top score that anybody is going to put out there at any point for the DFS landscape. The 150 is going to be lower, only 228 here, whereas it was 255. 228 wouldn't have even been top 100, I don't think, in the Millie Maker. No, it wouldn't even been top 100. So really quick, let's go in and repost this. So what do we like here? This Millie Maker lineup, Aaron Rodgers, Devonta Adams, that was obviously a super important combo. Josh Jacobs was another really important piece, but Aaron Rodgers was only 3% owned. He was only 2.6% owned. Josh Jacobs was the highest owned player in this lineup at 25.4% owned. Devonta Adams, 19% owned. So Devonta Adams being 19% owned, where Aaron Rodgers is only 3% owned, that just kind of shows how popular Devonta Adams was, whereas other stacks were more popular. But if you think that Devonta Adams is going to do really, really well, usually you're probably going to be wanting to have his quarterback as well. Aaron Rodgers, I think, has gotten a really bad rap through the offseason, and people were a bit gun shy to use him in week one and use him as their quarterback when we had guys like Lamar Jackson and we had Russell Wilson in a great spot. And Russell Wilson obviously did well as well. Tom Brady and Drew Brees were both facing off in what was supposed to be a higher scoring game. So people being low on Aaron Rodgers doesn't really surprise me. It was kind of silly to be low on him, considering he is one of the most talented quarterbacks that we have seen in the NFL. Going into week one, people just think that they know what's going to happen, whereas you don't know what's going to happen in week one. And I think those biases from the offseason, as much as the season long guys do very well in season long, I think that they can kind of let their biases get in the way in week one. There's an argument to be made that the Love draft pick would push Rodgers. I mean, you can say that, I guess, but that's just another one of those narratives, right? Like, in the offseason, I think that you see things happen, and you listen to people talk about, I don't know, CeeDee Lamb, or you listen to people talk about Antonio Gibson, or you listen to people talk about Laviska Shenault, and like all these different guys that are coming up and being drafted, and they are supposed to make this impact or that impact. And you talk about players that have been performing badly over the last year or the last 2 years or whatever. I mean, look at Cam Newton. People will completely abandon ship on Cam Newton, and he ended up crushing for the Patriots because, of course, he did. Like, it was easy to think that a former MVP would do well playing with Bill Belichick, but people don't care about that. Aaron Rodgers is just another one of those kind of like casualties. Hey, what's up, dude? How you doing? Aaron Rodgers is just another one of those season-long bias casualties where people said that he was toast, that he was dust, but he just hated Mike McCarthy a lot, which I think makes sense because Mike McCarthy is a shitty coach that is super conservative and doesn't put his players in position to really find their ceiling. And I think that Aaron Rodgers probably at this point in his career is not as flashy, but I think that he's still as smart. And I think that he still has a lot of capabilities that other QBs don't. And getting rid of a shitty coach is going to put you in a position to do better. So people have been low on Aaron Rodgers, which explains his 3% ownership, where Devonta Adams is 19% owned. You would think that people would want a little bit more of Aaron Rodgers if Devonta Adams is about 20% owned in a contest with 500,000 people. So this lineup with that combination, Aaron Rodgers, Devonte Adams, and Alan Lazard, pretty low owned stack. I suppose I could open up the NFL range of outcomes so that we can kind of take a look at how we felt about them, which of course I think we felt pretty good about them. We talked a lot about Aaron Rodgers with Devonte Adams and bringing it back with Dalvin Cook, which was something that not a lot of people did. One sec. There it is. That's something not a lot of people did, obviously. People really don't like making a combination of a quarterback, wide receiver, and then bringing it back with a running back. But here's week one. So, I mean, Aaron Rodgers here with Devontae Adams and Alan Lazard, that's not like a super high ranking combo. It was one of the top five overall in projections. It was projected for 58.04 fantasy points. And if you throw it into the custom stack tool, you can go Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Lazard. And then, I mean, you can, at this point, like with just those three, you have a 27% chance to have all of them hit over 20 fantasy points. And then if you add in Dalvin Cook, like I just talked about, I mean, we talked about this a lot in the Discord, where that catapults up the 20 plus percentage, makes the LevX score better, it makes the projection pretty good. If you remove him there and you put in Adam Thielen, which is, you know, a combination that won people a lot of money, it increases the 20 plus percentage, increases 3x percentage, increases projection a little bit. So adding him in just kind of like made a lot of sense. Even if you didn't use Alan Lazard and you just went with Aaron Rodgers and Devontae Adams and added in Dalvin Cook, it makes a really good stack. That this stack overall probably would have been great in cash games. It obviously was great in GPPs. If you add in Adam Thielen instead, we're still sitting here at about a 40%, 20 plus percentage and an 18.36 projection. Like those are pretty good scores. So we were on that. We talked about that a lot in the Discord. We talked about it a lot in terms of being kind of an off the wall stack. It was a situation where we knew that Aaron Rodgers was going to be lower owned. I don't think that Devonta Adams projected for massive ownership. Well, 19% ownership, but as far as wide receivers, look, he's the second highest projected wide receiver on the slate for me. Somebody who should have been focused on quite a bit. Then Alan Lazard was not projected well, but he was nice and cheap, for 4,900. So it allowed you to do whatever you wanted to do. It was just a good stack. I think that it made sense to use him. Obviously, Russell Wilson did really well with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. Jimmy Garoppolo did not do near as well. Lamar Jackson crushed with Mark Andrews and Marquis Brown, and we'll talk about that here in a second when we go through some subscriber lineups. And Drew Brees and Michael Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. Michael Thomas did not do well. Emmanuel Sanders did better, but like we didn't like this anyway. This did not have that good of a chance of being a solid stack, really. It was only slightly better than a couple of the other stacks. The projection was really high because of Michael Thomas, but we didn't really like Drew Brees all that much. So I think that when you look back at this, those kind of things make sense. Aaron Rodgers, Devontae Adams, Alan Lazard, pretty solid stack, all things considered. Raheem Mostert, we talked about him later on in the day in the Discord, where we started talking a little bit more about the San Francisco game and how I didn't think that it was going to play. And then we ended up like thinking about it and okay, well, they're probably going to try to fit this game in. And then we started talking about Tevin Coleman, who has sickle cell anemia, and he has pre-existing conditions. He has really bad concerns in terms of his health in less than perfect conditions, in bad conditions, and certainly an air quality index of 150 in San Francisco was going to be a pretty bad condition, and there was serious risk to him if he was going to be playing the full game. So we kind of started talking about, okay, if they do play that game, then the air quality isn't going to be that much better. Uh, Tevin Coleman probably isn't going to play much. He physically can't play much if he does have those pre-existing conditions. So we talked about Raheem Mostert as somebody who was probably going to benefit quite a bit from Tevin Coleman not being able to go full go in that game because of the air quality. So Raheem Mostert, I think, makes a lot of sense. Josh Jacobs, I didn't like Josh Jacobs all that much, and I'll be the first person to say that. I mean, when we go in and we look at the range of outcomes, that like the sheets didn't hate uh, Josh Jacobs at all. Like he was top five. He was a good play in terms of his median outcomes. He was good for 3x percentage. He was good for 4x percentage. Like there was a very, very, very good chance that he was going to be a top 10%, 100% chance that he was going to be top 10, but only a 35% chance that he was going to be top five. And I didn't love it simply because we have seen him be game script dependent in the past. Like last year, it was really, really hard for me to play Josh Jacobs consistently, even though we knew that he had a huge ceiling. We knew that he could catch out of the backfield. We knew that he was a good goal line back. But John Gruden's an idiot. And so I just didn't want to have a very popular Josh Jacobs who was projected to be, top five in ownership. I didn't want to have him and have the Panthers get out to a lead over the Raiders and then have them abandon the run and be dumping it off to somebody who, is not Josh Jacobs. So I really didn't like Josh Jacobs all that much. Kudos to the people who did play him and had more confidence in him than I did, but I don't necessarily regret that decision. At 6,800, I think that he was fairly priced, and I think that he found his ceiling. Obviously, he ran in for a couple touchdowns, and he did have quite a few targets. So we'll see. But the game script was good for him, and it was a competitive game, so it was nice to see that, and hopefully he can continue that through the year. I'll be a little bit less like gun shy on him moving forward, I think, because I'm really encouraged after that usage week one. But I just wasn't really ready to take on that risk on him if he was going to be subbed out for a receiving back if they were to end up being down and they wanted to pass the ball more. I just didn't want to take on that risk. I thought there were other places that made more sense. I think it was a TD for Mostert on the run where they reviewed it, but he said he landed at the half-yard line. Yeah, that sucks. I mean, he put up 25 fantasy points. Like, with the touchdown, obviously it's better, but 25 fantasy points is pretty good. No Kuechly really hurts Carolina D. That's kind of the other thing. Like, week one, nobody really knows how good teams' defenses are going to be. Like, everybody thought that the Washington defense was going to be terrible, and that's why everybody was like, oh, yeah, you got to start Desean Jackson and Zach Ertz, and, like, the Philadelphia Eagles were going to be chalky. Because Washington's defense is going to be terrible. And then they ended up getting 8 sacks and being a chalky defense. And you know what I mean? I think that people are going to like hang on to their priors. And I know that a lot of people in the Discord are like, oh, well, Carolina's defense is going to be bad. And you can say that, but Washington's defense was supposed to be bad as well. Tampa Bay's defense is supposed to be bad as well. There's a lot of defenses that are supposed to be bad that ended up not being terrible, and some defenses that had better games. And the 49ers defense is supposed to be really, really good, and they kind of got torched by Arizona. So all of those things, like you can cling to the priors that you had going into the season, but the fact of the matter is that we really don't know how good teams' defenses are going to be coming into the next year. And especially, to add on to that, year over year, defenses, that there's like hardly any correlation between a good defense one year and a good defense the next year. So that kind of thing, week one, I never even want to talk about what defense is supposed to be good or bad. I just want to try to project the best baselines that I can and project the best usage that I can, and put people in a position to be on good players that have good usage and not really care about the defense. We can care about the defense after 4 weeks when things stabilize a little bit more. But even then, defense doesn't matter. Thank you for subscribing, sir. I appreciate you. Strictly Business. That's awesome. They only gave up 3.7 yards per carry. Yeah, I mean, they didn't do absolutely horribly. How much do I look into O line versus D line matchups? Honestly, I don't. I don't look into it much. I do think that it is good. I think that it's a good thing to look into. But thank you, baby. But I don't look into it all that often. For the most part, like I do want defenses, and I go over to Football Outsiders and I'll glance at like O line versus D line stuff. Where if an O line has a very good advantage in terms of run blocking, then yeah, maybe I'll give a little bit of a leg up to a running back, or if they're a really good pass blocking group, yeah, I'll give a little bit of a leg up to a quarterback. But for the most part, those margins are really, really small, and a lot of the time, like unless it is a really, really big deviation from the average, like a Dallas Cowboys offensive line 2 years ago. They were just maulers, and they were one of the big reasons why the running game was so good for Dallas. But for the most part, what we care about is volume and opportunity and usage and that kind of stuff. While it is a little bit valuable, it's more of a tiebreaker for me. Oh yeah, for sure. Love doing these reviews. So here is, I mean, we just broke down this lineup. Washington football team, they were one of the most popular defenses on the week just because they were $2,000. Kelvin Ridley, awesome play. We talked about him a lot in the Discord. Really liked that Seattle and Atlanta game. And this lineup, actually, there's a lot of really good correlations going on here. He had Aaron Rodgers, Devonte Adams, Allen Lazard, brought it back with Adam Thielen. And then he also had Greg Olsen and Calvin Ridley against each other in a game that was supposed to be a shootout. So that combination of players, like, that's really, really smart. You get to have double correlations there where you're not only correlating your main team with your quarterback, but you're also correlating your one-offs. So Greg Olsen and Calvin Ridley together, that makes a lot of sense and was a really smart pairing. Raheem Mostert, we really liked him. Josh Jacobs, I didn't like him that much, but I understand why people liked him. I did think that he had a big ceiling. I just didn't trust the consistency. Dropping over into the 150, score was considerably lower. This one was Lamar Jackson, Josh Jacobs, Antonio Gibson, Devonte Adams, Calvin Ridley, Paris Campbell, Mark Andrews, Raheem Mostert, and the Washington football team defense. Really quick, Washington football team is going to be fucking annoying to say for the rest of my life. They need to change that. Secondary stacks are key, IMO. You love the Seattle Atlanta secondary stack in every lineup I had, not straight stacking that game. Yeah. I think that's a really, really smart point to make is the more, like, you don't have to stop at just one set of correlation. You can correlate your secondary stacks as well, and that's something that I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later in the Discord, but it is something that I think smart people do when they build out an MME run is not only are you putting together your stacks for your teams and you're putting together your comebacks and your QB wide receiver, opponent wide receiver stacks, but you're also putting together groups of players that you want together for your secondary stacks. So for instance, like with this Millie Maker lineup, if you put together stacks of Green Bay and forced one player coming back, and then you also put together a couple different groups of like, if you have Greg Olsen, then give me Calvin Ridley, or if I have a Seattle player, then give me an Atlanta player. That's another really smart way to handle things in an MME run. But that's other game theory stuff. The 150, there's a lot of things that make sense here, right? So Josh Jacobs, we already talked about. Devonte Adams, we already talked about. Calvin Ridley, we already talked about. Raheem Mostert and the Washington football team, both also pieces that we already talked about. Antonio Gibson, I fucking hated in GPPs this week. I'll be the first person to admit that. And I'm not going to victory lap it because I think that it was pretty obvious, but he just wasn't ever going to project well. I've been talking about it for like a month where the most that you could possibly project him for is somewhere between like 12 to 15% owner or 12 to 15 fantasy points. We had no idea how much of the goal line work he was going to get. We had no idea how many carries. He was in a 4-person committee. Like, it just wasn't a good spot. And people just wanted to play him because he was 4K. And I played him in cash, which I'll get to here in a second. But it just wasn't a spot that you really wanted to take him in GPPs, especially at higher ownership. So him playing Antonio Gibson here did allow him to have Lamar Jackson, Josh Jacobs, and Devonta Adams together. And that was kind of a key thing. So, yeah, if you take Antonio Gibson and allows you to have those things, then that's great. But according to the other lineup, like, you didn't have to do that, Calvin Ridley, we already talked about. He's a great play. Paris Campbell, that one is kind of like off the board. I think that there were some smart people that were kind of on him. I've seen some smart people on Twitter that talked about Paris Campbell a bit, but that one's right out of right field, and that's that 2% owned play that allowed him to end up winning this 150. Everything else kind of made sense. Lamar Jackson with Mark Andrews. You don't need to bring that back with a Cleveland player at all because, I mean, Baltimore just kind of runs over teams regardless, and so much of that offense comes from Lamar Jackson and Mark Andrews that you didn't really need to have a bring back, and we talked about that in the Discord for sure. Paris Campbell is really the only play here that is off the board. Everything else I can understand where he got to, and I think that everybody in this community can understand how he got there. I wouldn't have played Antonio Gibson, but here we are. If you divide payout entries from field goals, the Millie was 28%. What do you mean if I divide payout entries from field goals? So now that we talked about those two things, we will go into my lineups, and we'll kind of talk about these. I am doing the $100 challenge, so I started this challenge obviously with $100. I'm going to be playing each one of the main slates and maybe some shorter slates if I end up getting up on things a little bit. But I started with $100. I played with an 80-20 split in cash and GPP. So I ended up playing $17 in cash, $17 in cash and $3 in GPPs. I ended up not cashing anything because Josh Jacobs and Devonta Adams were each 50% owned in cash and just ended up crushing. So we'll go over my cash lineup. We'll go over my GPP lineup. But going into next week, I have $80 for my bankroll now, and that means that I'm going to be playing somewhere around $13 in cash and $3 in GBPs. My bankroll and play will be $16 next week. So my cash lineup was Lamar Jackson, Christian McCaffrey, Boston Scott, Tyler Lockett, Marvin Jones, Marquis Brown, Ian Thomas, and Antonio Gibson. I told everybody that I thought that Lamar Jackson and Christian McCaffrey were the places that you really just kind of needed to start in your cash lineups. I also thought that Boston Scott was a really strong play. I talked about Boston Scott in both GPPs and cash. I think that in comparison to Antonio Gibson, he was a much better play overall just because of a couple of things, right? Like when we're taking running backs, and specifically cheaper running backs, we want to make sure that we have a couple things in play. We want to make sure that we're playing them on a team that is a favorite. We want to make sure that they are a running back that has shown capability before and isn't just kind of falling into the role and going to be part of a committee. And we want to make sure that they have a little bit of receiving chops and some touchdown equity. So Boston Scott, I think, checked more of those boxes than Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson was, and I know that I played him as well, but Antonio Gibson was on a team that was a touchdown underdog. He was a part of a committee. He had never had any NFL experience in his life. He was a rookie, so we didn't know that he was going to have all of the work that people thought that he was going to have. And the only reason why he was a cash play was because he was only 4K, and that's the only reason why I had him was because, one, I thought that he was going to be really highly owned, and two, he was only 4K. He opened up quite a bit. So in GPPs, terrible play. In cash, I swallowed it just so that I could make sure that I could fit in the other people, and because if he did go off at high ownership, I didn't want to not have him. Boston Scott, on the other hand, was on a team that was a touchdown favorite. We know that he was a big part of the offense last year when he did get his hand in the pot and when he was able to play and prove himself. He did have receiving work. There was only two other running backs on the roster, and one of them was a free agent that was picked up a couple of weeks before. So he kind of checked all those boxes for me, and he was only 4,800. So I thought that he was a great play in both cash and GPP. Obviously, he ended up getting hurt, so that sucks, but he got hurt in the first half and already had 7.4 fantasy points. I think that he was kind of on his way to have a really, really good day. You played Tyrod in cash? That's a big oof. I mean, I get it because he's a mobile quarterback that was cheap. I get that, but definitely a big oof. I like Trubisky a little bit more, and I think that most people liked Russell Wilson, but I understand the Tyrod play. Dang it, did I miss yours? Did you submit a lineup for lineup review? Because I haven't done sub lineup review yet. I just got to my lineups. So I told everybody to start with Lamar Jackson, Christian McCaffrey, and Boston Scott. I thought that was kind of like where you start in cash. I added in Antonio Gibson as well because I thought he was going to be highly owned, and I didn't want him to go off at really cheap and highly owned in cash. Those are really the only reasons why I used him. I just didn't want to miss out on that. I used Tyler Lockett because he was in that game where Seattle and Atlanta, we thought it was going to be a shootout and ended up being a pretty damn good game to target. Seattle did put up 38 fantasy points. Tyler Lockett finished 8 yards short of the bonus, which sucks, but I had him higher projected than DK Metcalf, so I was fine with using him in cash. Marvin Jones Jr., we knew was going to be heavy chalk with no Kenny Galladay, so I wanted to play him, and I didn't have any problems using him because I thought the Lions were in a good spot anyway. Marquis Brown, again, thought that he was going to be highly owned. Only 5,100. I liked him significantly more than I liked Desean Jackson. So using him, I think, made more sense and ended up paying off well as well. Plus, it correlated well with Lamar Jackson. So I'm never going to be mad about using a wide receiver with my quarterback in cash. Even though with Lamar Jackson, you really don't need one. Like, you can play him naked in cash. And then I used the Jets defense, which I mean, using them over the Washington defense, I thought that they were in a little bit better of a spot. Defense is super variant, and I didn't really want any part of the chalk defense anyway. But the Bills give up more sacks on average than the Philadelphia Eagles do. So for $100 more, I'll take that. That's not a bad pivot. And they ended up being okay. 7 fantasy points from the Jets there is not a bad spot. Washington ended up paying off better, but I didn't mind using Jets there at all. And then I used Ian Thomas. I thought that Ian Thomas would be a little bit more owned than he was. He ended up only being like 2% owned in most of the cash contests that I was in. He was only 3,300 in a game that had seen its implied run or its implied total jump by like 3.5 points, the most on the slate. He was really cheap. There's no Greg Olsen there anymore. He impressed people last year when he was able to be the starting tight end. So I thought that he was going to be a little bit higher owned. He ended up not being highly owned and not doing super well, and that's something that you always want to avoid in cash. So I think, honestly, Ian Thomas is probably my biggest mistake here. We will talk a little bit about Josh Jacobs and Devonta Adams as well, but I think that Ian Thomas, like, if I wouldn't have been okay with playing Ian Thomas here, I probably end up trying to pay up a little bit, pay down somewhere else, maybe pay down at Tyler Lockett or Christian McCaffrey or something like that, but um, I thought that it was going to be higher on, so I think that was a big mistake by me. What type of cash games did I play for the $100 challenge? I only played double ups, and that was a fuck up because I'm not great at double ups. I'm really good at head to heads, where I can end up kind of picking out my opponents and putting myself in a better position and playing like the $1 if I'm going to be doing this challenge. Uh, Playing the double ups, like they are a bit softer, but then when all of this chalk kind of goes all the way off, like if I could have beat the couple people that I did, I could have kind of like made back a little bit of my investment, which I think is really important for this challenge. So next week I'm going to be playing a lot more head to heads, probably like 75% head to heads and then 25% double up, and then play whatever GPP I can afford with my GPP allotment, which is only $3. I'll probably just play the $3. But yeah, I played all double ups, and that was actually another mistake by me as well. Because I know that I'm better at head to heads, and I just kind of snap entered the double ups without thinking about it because I have not done a challenge like this in a long time. But this cash lineup, the big things here, right, are that I didn't have Josh Jacobs and Devonte Adams, and having Devonte Adams over Tyler Lockett would not have been that difficult if I had gone to a couple different spots, right? If I'd have instead of having uh, Lamar Jackson, if I'd have dropped down to Russell Wilson, I could have jumped up from Tyler Lockett up to Devonte Adams, or I could have jumped up from Boston Scott to somebody else more expensive, like Raheem Mostert or something like that. I could have jumped up from Antonio Gibson, something like that. Um, I think that one of the big problems here is I probably should have cared more about the ownership of Devonta Adams. I talk a lot about in the Discord, just trying to match overall ownership. So starting with Christian McCaffrey at 24% projected ownership, I think I'm fine with that. Um, taking Boston Scott 30%, fine with that as well. Marvin Jones Jr. 18%, awesome. Lamar Jackson 16%, awesome. But then outside of that, I really didn't have enough chalk. Like Devonte Adams, I should have targeted at only 7,300 for 19% ownership. Josh Jacobs, I should have really started with Christian McCaffrey, Devonte Adams, Josh Jacobs, and Boston Scott. That's what I should have started with. So when you're building cash lineups, your goal isn't necessarily to beat everybody in the contest. Your goal is just to take advantage of the people that make mistakes, like I did this week. So if you can have as much chalk as possible, and we've talked about this strategy for weeks now in baseball and in basketball, just try to make the chalkiest lineup that you possibly can. Enter in ownership projections into whatever optimizer you're using and make a cash lineup and see what it spits out. See who you need to be focusing on. This week, I really should have gone Christian McCaffrey. Honestly, Christian McCaffrey, Josh Jacobs, Boston Scott, and then Devonta Adams. And if I sort highest to lowest here, like you probably could have just started with these, top 5 players right here, top 6 players, and still had money left to kind of fill in the blanks. We know that quarterback doesn't match all that badly, or we know that quarterbacks don't have that wide of a range of outcomes, really. Yeah, Lamar Jackson is going to be somebody who gives you a great floor in cash, but quarterback, you don't really need to worry about it that much. So what I should have done, and what I encourage you guys to do when you're building cash lineups in the future, is sort by projected ownership on whatever site you're on and just kind of try to plug in as much chalk as possible. You're joining me in week 2. Awesome. Cool. Chalk is the enemy in GPPs, kind of. Like, what you really want to avoid is bad chalk. Chalk is not necessarily the enemy. Chalk is chalk for a reason. Like, Boston Scott was a popular play for a reason. Christian McCaffrey was a popular play for a reason. These guys were chalky because they were good plays, because they were consensus solid plays. The only play that I really, really hated here was Desean Jackson. And his LevX was the worst on the slate. I thought he was the worst play on the slate. So not having him, not having Antonio Gibson, like once you get into these kind of like higher ranges, if you sort this smallest to largest, like you can kind of just cross these 2 guys off the ballot. Like anything over 10% in negative LevX is just not great. But chalk is chalk for a reason. They're good plays, and really you only need so much leverage, especially in cash games. You don't need any leverage. All you're trying to do is play all of the chalky pieces that you possibly can, so that anybody who does not have the chalk ends up missing out on the points that the chalk scores. You're going to win a lot more often than not if you're playing with the vast majority of the field, because you only have to beat 50% of the people. In GPPs, it's another kind of story about building in leverage where you need it. It's not necessarily about avoiding all the chalk. You needed Devonte Adams. You needed Josh Jacobs. You needed Russell Wilson. You needed Kelvin Ridley. Like, all those guys were popular. The things that you need to avoid are the chalk plays that don't make any sense and that you're going to be able to pass a lot of the field if they end up doing badly. Desean Jackson is a perfect example of that this first week, where he was projected for 21% ownership. I didn't even have him projected over 10 fantasy points. I thought he was an awful play. He's boomer bust. He needs big plays to make it happen. When somebody like Desean Jackson is going to be popular, who has no floor and needs most things to happen right for him in order to find his ceiling, like that's a good place to fade. Boston Scott was another good place to fade at 31% ownership. Honestly, there really wasn't all that much that he needed to do to fail, right? And he did end up failing. He ended up getting hurt. Obviously, he would have been better if he hadn't gotten hurt, but like those are the kind of plays where 31% owned running back on a team that has multiple running backs, maybe you fade him. Antonio Gibson was a really, really good fade in that regard, because like we knew that he wasn't going to be all that great, but people wanted to play him just so that they could fit other people in. So chalk isn't inherently a bad thing. Chalk's chalk for a reason. You just got to avoid the big landmines, the ones that can help you pass the majority of the field if they end up going wrong. Desean Jackson, I thought he was a pretty good example of that. Somebody who was boom or bust that was going to have more ownership than he deserved, and the field ended up getting burned by that. So looking at Slate Millimaker, if you divide payouts from the Millimaker is 28%. If I X out players from over 28% and start with that, takes out Boston Scott. You didn't need Thomas or CMC yesterday. Oh, I see what you're meaning. I don't necessarily know that that's like a way that you would do things, but it's interesting. Like we can talk about it more in Discord and we can monitor things. Um, I don't think that it necessarily was an incredible way to X out Boston Scott. Like I kind of want to move away from him as a talking point because he got injured. Like we don't know what the actual outcome was if he plays through the full game. It's one of those things where it's just like you can say, well, shit happens, and that's why you fade chalk. But an injury situation, like an injury situation with Marlon Mack, I mean, you can't really consider that as something that like you faded them because you knew they would get hurt. That's not really something that I want to talk about. So I think Boston Scott probably would have been fine. You didn't need Thomas or CMC. Well, CMC ended up doing really, really well. You didn't need him, but you still could find success with him. Multiple people found success with him. So, and Thomas, yeah, there were better wide receiver plays underneath him, but that's an interesting theory. So let's talk about that a little bit farther forward. Here is my GPP lineup. So we'll talk about this a little bit really quick before we get into subscriber lineups. Do you think you can make notes for chalk players moving forward, similar to what I do for pitchers? Yeah, I can do that. I can add that in. Matthew Stafford was somebody that I liked a lot. My GPP lineup ended up being Matthew Stafford, Dalvin Cook, Boston Scott, Allen Robinson, Calvin Ridley, Marvin Jones, TJ Hawkinson, Tyler Lockett, and the Jets defense. A couple pieces of this came from my cash lineup as well. You know, I liked Marvin Jones a lot. I liked Tyler Lockett a lot. I liked the Jets. Those pieces kind of made it over into both lineups, which I never have any problem with that. I don't think that you need to fade everything that you have in chalk or in cash into GPPs if you're going to be different elsewhere. I liked the Lions stack a lot, and I talked about that quite a bit. I think it was one of the 4 stacks that I said that I liked a lot in the Discord. It ended up just barely coming up shy of being, good and cashing everything. I ended up like 6 points short of the cash line, and Matthew Stafford, at the end of the game, they threw that touchdown to DeAndre Swift where he dropped it, and that would have been a swing of like 7 fantasy points, I think. So I cash it if that happens. Tyler Lockett ended up 3 or 8 receiving yards short of a 100-yard bonus, so pretty close to cashing if that happens. Allen Robinson dropped 2 touchdowns, pretty close to cashing if that happens. There was just a lot of things that happened that it's like, well, tough luck. I really liked this lineup. The things that, obviously I wish would have gone a little bit better, focusing on Devonte Adams probably over Tyler Lockett. I could have dropped down from, Dalvin Cook down to Josh Jacobs and then ended up getting up from Tyler Lockett to Devonte Adams and ended up crushing. That's a swing of like 45 fantasy points, something like that, put up 190. That would have been awesome. But a lot of this stuff, it just is what it is. In GPP lineups, you count up all the things that happened and you count up the coin flips. And this wasn't going to take anything down this week. Like, you needed to be on that Seattle Atlanta game in order to really get there. You needed to be on the Packers to get there. So there were a couple other spots that mattered more. But I didn't mind this at all. I think that if you played the Lions, you were on a good spot. They just ended up kind of falling apart in a couple different spots. I know you were big on Lamar Jackson, but there was solid QB plays. Wouldn't Jackson need to be X amount of actual points to avoid other QB? No. I mean, we never talk about X amount of actual points. It's all relative. So Lamar Jackson, remember, they blew out the Browns. So they pretty much didn't play the fourth quarter. He still ended up putting up like 27 fantasy points and doing really well. And he didn't even really have to try all that hard. Raven stacks like Lamar Jackson was a winning lineup in the 150. Like, he ended up doing really, really well. And when I have in the range of outcomes a quarterback that I think is this much better than other quarterbacks, projected at 45% to be the top finishing quarterback on the week, Russell Wilson right there. And he did really well and ended up being the top quarterback on the week. Josh Allen, really, really well, ended up being right there. Cam Newton, really well, ended up being right there. So I think taking Lamar Jackson isn't a problem. Yeah, he was expensive, but you pay for the expensiveness in week 1, especially because I knew that he was going to be somebody who was going to retain the same things that he did last year. Russell Wilson, they talked about letting him cook, but that's a team that has, in the past, ran the ball a lot when they have a lead. Josh Allen, a little bit shaky, didn't like the wind, didn't like the situation there, really low implied run total or implied team total. Cam Newton in a good situation. I probably should have cared a little bit more about him. Matthew Stafford right there, used him in GPPs. Phillip Rivers, not great. Matt Ryan, he did really well. Carson Wentz, terrible. So, yeah, I mean, for the opportunity cost, like in week one, I'd much rather pay up and have that really, really solid floor and really, really high ceiling from a quarterback, especially because I liked his other options. He played 30% QB, 40 wide receiver, 40 wide receiver, or 40 running back, 40 wide receiver, 20 TE, 10 on defense exposures. However you want to run it, man. I think that everybody has a different way to do their MME stuff. I like talking about that stuff in the Discord, but I didn't do MME this week, so I can't really talk too much to that. I When I would MME, I'd usually go low on wide receiver, really low on tight end, higher on running back, and lower on QB, just because there's so much that can happen for QB. And I think that you probably did a lot of that right. So yeah, GPP lineup. I don't have any problem with it. If I would have done anything differently, I probably would have gone down from Dalvin Cook and then paid up from Tyler Lockett or maybe Calvin or Allen Robinson or something like that, right? Like doing any of those things, I think getting me Josh Jacobs or Devonta Adams would have been nice, and they were projected well. So yeah, my range of outcomes come from Sims being ran and not personal feeling based. Yeah, I mean that they're just baselines. Like I don't really care so much about any biases that are happening or anything like that. So this is the first subscriber lineup that we have. It's from T-Bot. You ended up doing really, really well. It's a 200-point lineup, which is fantastic, obviously. Congrats to him. But it's Matthew Stafford, Dalvin Cook, Josh Jacobs, Devonte Adams, Anthony Miller, Jalen Rieger, TJ Hawkinson, Chris Carson, and Washington football team. So he ended up going with that Detroit stack with Matthew Stafford and TJ Hawkinson, which is a really nice way to get off of the Marvin Jones chalk that we knew was going to be there, while also keeping your upside because without Kenny Galladay, we knew that there was going to be an increase of targets to TJ Hawkinson and Marvin Jones Jr. So that's annoying. We ended up knowing that he was going to be a better play, and he was relatively cheap. So avoiding the Marvin Jones chalk, that's awesome. This is a really smart way to put together a GPP lineup. He brought it back with Anthony Miller, avoiding the Allen Robinson chalk or the Allen Robinson play. And Anthony Miller ended up doing better than Allen Robinson. So these are kind of like some things that just came together and worked out really, really well for him. The Josh Jacobs, Dalvin Cook, Chris Carson combination. We talked a lot about Dalvin Cook and Chris Carson in the Discord. I really liked Dalvin Cook. Thought that he was a great play this week. And Chris Carson, we talked a lot about how Russell Wilson's ceiling games have been combined with his or correlated well with his running backs in the past because of how often they end up paying off together. So him going with Chris Carson in a spot where it was supposed to be a shootout, like that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Chris Carson ended up getting 2 receiving touchdowns, which helped out in a shootout. So him playing those 3 running backs together, it avoided Christian McCaffrey, it avoided Boston Scott. It was a really nice way to get exposure to that game, that Seattle-Atlanta game, while also avoiding some of the really chalky running backs and playing a mid-range. So we liked all 3 of those running backs. I was a little bit lower on Josh Jacobs, but I know that a lot of people liked him. So I think those 3 running backs had a lot of upside and worked together well. Devonte Adams, we talked about a lot. I think that he paid off super well. Obviously, I mean, top ended up scoring on the slate, and he was second highest projected wide receiver on the slate as well. So really liked him in the range of outcomes. And Jalen Rieger, man, that's some balls. I wouldn't have played Jalen Rieger. That's a wild play, but really, really smart, and he was cheap. So having him, I'm sure that it just ended up being one of those situations where he was the last player that he plugged in. He was like, "Well, I have this much money," and typically you want to avoid that, but I can't knock the results here at all. What day will I dive into week 2? That'll probably be Saturday, but obviously I talk throughout the week in the Discord and with subs in the community. So If you are not a subscriber to the site, run over to paydirt.ghost.io and come subscribe and join the community. It's only 25 bucks a month. If you don't want to do that, then I will be on Twitch streaming probably Friday or Saturday. I'm not quite sure what day I'm going to jump into week 2. What was Sheet saying about Green Bay and the Vikings game? We talked about that at the beginning of the video. This is going to be posted on the site so that you can kind of like catch up on all that kind of stuff. But it ended up being a really nice looking stack for sure. You tried to pivot off the chalk, and yeah, you were low on cash. Yeah, you did pivot off the chalk. You did really, really well on putting together that Detroit-Chicago correlation with avoiding the chalk. Like, that was really, really smart, and I commend you. It sucks that Stafford had that touchdown dropped because that's probably a huge swing for you. Placing 21st, that puts you at like 206 or something like that. So I'm sure that sucked for you to see. That sucked more for you than me. All right, let's move on to the next one. I'm probably going to do 3 just because my voice is starting to hurt and I'm not a great streamer yet. So I'll do 3 and then we'll talk through the rest in Discord if I have time. This was DSH3. It looks like, because he didn't include the quarterback in the stack, but it looks like he used Trubisky because he does have Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller and bringing it back to TJ Hawkinson. So process of elimination for quarterbacks, and assuming that he went with correlation, I'm guessing that he used Trubisky here. So he used Mitchell Trubisky, Dalvin Cook, Boston Scott, Devonta Adams, Robinson, Miller, Hawkinson, Emmanuel Sanders, and the Patriots defense. We talked a lot about the Bears stack. Trubisky was one of the quarterbacks that looked like he was one of the best leverage for the week. He was really cheap, only $5,400. Had him to hit 2x his fantasy or 2x his price 95% of the time, 20 plus 28% of the time. He ended up being somebody who was projected at really, really low ownership. He was one of the better quarterbacks in terms of 4x percentage, meaning how often he was going to 4x his salary. Like, he looked like he was in a pretty good position, and only 1.75% ownership in a cheap stack that allows you to have things like Devonta Adams and CMC and stuff like that. Like, that was a good spot to go. It was one of the GPP plays that we talked about a lot in the Discord. So kudos to him and having the balls to do that. Going with Boston Scott, I think makes a lot of sense here in this lineup as well. Dalvin Cook, Emmanuel Sanders. Dalvin Cook, something that we talked about, he was probably one of my favorite running back plays on the week. After just signing that extension, I expected him to get a lot of work. Devonta Adams, obviously a great play. Going with Allen Robinson, Anthony Miller, and TJ Hawkinson, it avoids the Marvin Jones chalk, which is awesome for GPPs, especially considering he was going to be high owned and one of those more kind of boomer bust plays. Going with Allen Robinson and Anthony Miller, if Allen Robinson catches one of those touchdowns towards the end of the game, ends up being a lot better of a stack, but still, for the price on all of this stack, it ended up doing really, really well. Emmanuel Sanders did end up getting a touchdown as well, so he ended up doing all right. I think he ended up being a better LevX play by the end of the week after I was done with projections as well. So at only 6% ownership in a game that was supposed to be a shootout, not a bad play at all. And then the Patriots defense over Miami. It was relatively expensive. I think that if you end up paying down from the Patriots and going down to the Washington football team defense and paying up in Emmanuel Sanders, you probably end up with like 185, 190 fantasy points or something. But overall, I see exactly what you were trying to do with this lineup. There were a couple pivots, but I think that the core of Trubisky, Devonta Adams, Allen Robinson, Anthony Miller, and TJ Hawkinson is fantastic. The one-offs, like, if you would have gone down from Dalvin Cook to Josh Jacobs, gone down from the Patriots down to the Washington football team, and up from Emmanuel Sanders to, like, I think you probably could have afforded Mostert. If you do that, would have been awesome. That would have been a huge lineup. On FD, the flex is running back, and DK is a wide receiver flex or running back like Kamara that catches high passes. The flex, you can use running backs or wide receivers depending on the slate. Most of the time, if you're going to use running backs, it's because there are a lot of really good, really consistent running backs on the slate or high upside running backs on the slate. You use wide receivers when there are less running backs that you like on the week. So it's really just slate dependent and chalk dependent and value dependent and everything like that. So you usually use the flex to either have a running back that is super cheap or a wide receiver with a lot of upside. Anyway, let's move on to the last lineup. which, yeah, I wanted to go over to this one, I think, because I wanted to critique this one a little bit. So this was Charlie Wilson's lineup. He's a subscriber in the Discord as well. He went with Gardner Minshew, Todd Gurley, Devin Singletary, Julio Jones, Devonte Adams, DJ Chark, Jared Cook, Marvin Hall, and the Washington football team for defense. So the main thing here that I have a problem with is that you didn't bring it back with any of the Indiana players. If you ended up stacking Jacksonville and having Gardner Minshew with DJ Chark, they were underdogs, you know? Like, you had to have thought that with Gardner Minshew and DJ Chark being in that lineup, like, yeah, there was no D.D. Westbrook, which ends up putting up DJ Chark a little bit more. And I did talk about liking DJ Chark. But you got to bring that back with another pass catcher, or at least have two pass catchers from Gardner Minshew if you think they're going to blow out Indiana. Having one pass catcher with Gardner Minshew just kind of like misses out on maximizing the correlation for that game. If Jacksonville was going to end up doing well enough that Gardner Minshew and DJ Chark end up winning you a GBP, it's because Indiana was also putting up points. It was very unlikely that Jacksonville was going to blow them out thanks to Gardner Minshew throwing 4 touchdown passes to DJ Chark. So you needed to bring that back with an Indiana player. I understand that you ran out of salary here because you ended up with Devonte Adams, Julio Jones. But if you would have come down from Jared Cook down to, I don't know, DJ or TJ Hawkinson, and then moved up from Marvin Hall to even Paris Campbell for Indianapolis, that would have maximized your correlation and put you in a better spot. And it actually would have given you a much better fantasy team as well. Todd Gurley and Devin Singletary. Todd Gurley, we talked about quite a bit. He popped in the range of outcomes. I didn't mind him at all. He did end up scoring a touchdown, so you can't knock that. At 6,100, you wanted more, but it ended up being a situation where they had to abandon the run completely because Seattle got out to a massive lead. And that's all that you could have asked for from Todd Gurley, is to get a touchdown and hopefully get some passes, but it ended up not working out. Devin Singletary, Buffalo ended up being one of the teams that had the highest possibility for rushing touchdowns, I think. I have to go back and look. Let's see. Yeah, so Buffalo was up here. 1.36 implied rushing touchdowns is pretty good. It was a really low total, but it was a team that prefers to run the ball in the end zone. Devin Singletary actually ended up not being a bad play here. He was shaky, but in GPPs, I think that you take that upside when there's a lot of people who are on other running backs that have just as much shakiness and just as much upside. And considering how many rushing touchdowns they were supposed to have, I think that he was actually an all right play. 2 Atlanta players and no Seattle players, probably not ideal. Yeah, that as well. So we talked about the secondary correlations earlier on in this little review, but having those 2 Atlanta players and ending up not having anybody from Seattle means that you think that Atlanta is just going to blow them out and not maximize the correlation from the Seattle-Atlanta game. So having those 2 Atlanta players and no Seattle, like, you missed out on correlation there. You missed out on correlation between Jacksonville and Indiana. This is kind of like the opposite of what took down the Millie Maker, right? Where he had 2 different sets of correlations between games. And you ended up without any correlation between games. You ended up cashing, which is awesome. Like Devonte Adams and Julio Jones ended up carrying you really, really well. But it's one of those situations where if you would have maximized the correlations and tried to build in a Paris Campbell, end up building in a Tyler Lockett or something like that with your Atlanta stuff, the correlations would have looked a little bit better. Just joined, what have you missed so far? Everything, because I am going to end this live stream now. I am going to put this up. I'm going to download it and put it up as a post on the site, so it'll be up in the next half hour or so. But thank you to everybody who else tuned in. If you are not a subscriber to the site, please come over and subscribe. We're going to have an awesome NFL season. That is paydirt.ghost.io. To those that are subscribers to me on here, thank you very much. I'm going to jump off and go run some more numbers, but we're going to have a baseball screencast tomorrow, and we'll continue on with the NFL stuff as the week goes on. So thanks for tuning in. Have